Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Russia this week, where it's not only sporting endeavour, but human rights that are being heavily scrutinised. As they are in Qatar, the huge preparations for the World Cup in 2022 have raised many questions about the rights of workers there. Among those expressing concern is Amnesty International. Now 3 million members strong, it was originally established in the UK in 1961 to lobby for freedom of opinion and religion and the release of political prisoners. But Amnesty has morphed into a proponent for a wider definition of human rights, its supporters saying it has become a force for good. So as it embarks on campaigns around the world, we ask, how does it pick the causes it's fighting for? And behind the scenes, Amnesty's going through big changes. With most of its leadership based in London, its workers have often been somewhat cut off from the field. The organisation says it needs a new structure to make it more effective and connected to the rest of the world. Will it work despite opposition from some of its own staff? The man leading Amnesty International talks to Al Jazeera. Salil Shetty, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera. Your own website says that Amnesty International is going through and embarking on an evolution of change. Many in the organisation say that that is tearing Amnesty apart. Do you agree that this process of evolution is proving quite painful for your organisation?
It is painful. There's no question about it. But it's Amnesty International was created and exists to prevent and end grave human rights violations. So if you look at its 52-year history, at every stage, the way it's remained the most relevant and most powerful human rights movement in the world is by adapting to the changing external realities. So if you think about it, when Peter Benenson, the British lawyer, set up Amnesty International, it was to free 2 Portuguese students who raised their glass toast to freedom under the Salazar regime. And the focus was really to write letters to release individual political prisoners. And we've done amazing amounts of work around that area. But soon it was realized that once you lock people up, those people are getting tortured inside prisons, which is why Amnesty started its work on torture. The UN Convention Against Torture was created, and Amnesty got the Nobel Peace Prize for that. And it goes on and on, the death penalty, the campaign against death penalty, because people were being locked up, but they were being put to the gallows. And this was even outside the framework of human rights law at the time. And the campaign against death penalty, when we started campaigning decades ago, there were only about 30 countries who were not executing people. Today it's the reverse. We only have about 30 to 40 countries who continue to execute people. So, and then women's rights, then we realize that actually political prisoners who are locked up, there are not that many women if you think about who's in prisons. So the issue of women's rights came in. So I think it's really important to understand that evolution and change is so critical for any organization to remain relevant, to remain effective. So what we're doing now, for example, that you mentioned the change, but what is the change? I think the change essentially is to make sure that Amnesty stands alongside human rights defenders and victims of human rights violations, stay as close to them, work alongside them. We didn't have that option in 1961 when Amnesty started. We had to be in London because it wasn't safe to be in a lot of places. We didn't have media freedoms like we have today. We didn't have technology. We didn't have telephones. All of the options we have today. But today, we didn't even have airplanes like the way we have today. But now we can be closer to the ground. We can be quicker. We can work with local organizations. There are many local organizations fighting for human rights, local defenders. So I think it's really important. It's difficult. Change is always difficult, but we're a long way now. We've done a lot of work. We've worked with our teams on the ground, and we're moving forward. So.
Why, though, so many of your staff, dedicated staff, why were so many of them opposed to those changes of moving the centralisation from the UK to other hubs around the world? Staff were prepared to go on strike over that, over redundancies. There's a lot of unhappiness, or there has been a lot of unhappiness at Amnesty. Why do you feel your staff felt that way?
Any change creates uncertainty, and that's always difficult. And it's natural. One has to. I think it's not unique to Amnesty. It happens everywhere. And I think we've kind of agreed to do it in a phased way, in a gradual way. I think some of the feedback we got was very relevant and correct.
Because you did actually suspend the idea for a while, didn't you? I mean, where are you at now? You put it back into place, have you?
No, we never suspended it. We agreed, on how it's going to be phased. How do we make sure the risks are taken care of? Because when people are out there at the front line, there are more risks to our staff as well, and so we have to take those things into account. And I think we factored those things in. So we've now, for example, in 2013, what we've done is to move the entire Africa program to Africa. And this year we're moving our work in Latin America and Asia. So we're doing it in a phased way.
What about Amnesty's role? For people who are outside the organisation, it can be quite difficult to identify what Amnesty's role is now. You've mentioned, of course, that it began as an organisation representing prisoners of conscience, but you campaign on so many issues now: gay rights, abortion rights, the arms trade. Is there not a danger that Amnesty's core messages are being diluted because you're campaigning across such a wide spectrum?
I think the core message is absolutely the same, which is to make sure that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights becomes real and meaningful to every human being in the world. And by definition, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is wide. And we can't say to somebody whose rights are being denied that no, that's not in our plan. So Central African Republic blows up. I can't tell people who are crying for help from Amnesty that this is not in our plan. It's an organization which has to respond to change. But you asked about, in a sense, also how we've evolved. But that's really important because it's linked to the first point you asked about the what we call moving closer to the ground. And I mentioned to you that that's important because we work more closely with the people on the ground. We can move faster, the quality improves. But there's another dimension which is very important, which many people don't know about Amnesty, which is that, yes, we do the research, the legal analysis, and we are deeply respected for the quality of our work. But the other dimension is that we are a people's movement. Amnesty is actually made up of more than 3 million members. And that allows us to be secular, apolitical, and financially independent. So we take no money from governments or corporations for our research and campaigning work. And this is important because these 3 million people who are the backbone of Amnesty, they are not only funding Amnesty's work at small contributions, $10, $15 a month, but they're also our campaigners. They are the movement. They put pressure on leaders to do the right thing. And this focus of building Amnesty in the South is also centrally about building a membership in the South, because as you know, the world outside is changing. So in India, in Nigeria, in Brazil, in Africa, it's really important that there are people from those countries who become part of this global human rights movement. And there's a huge interest in it, the growing middle class, young people. You're seeing all the protests all over the world. What's it about? It's about unaccountable governance, people taking injustice personally. And that's essentially we're opening up the possibility for Amnesty to become a truly global movement.
And you've been responsible, haven't you, for moving Amnesty in that direction, for saying that it's not just about human rights, it's about economic, social and cultural rights.
I mean, it wasn't just me. Amnesty is already, it was 10 years ago that Amnesty made the decision.
Let's move on to some of the key issues that Amnesty is interested in. We have to talk about Syria and the terrible situation in that country. How much access has Amnesty been able to have to Syria, to be able to speak to people on the ground? Are you able to operate there?
No, and this is a big part of the problem, in the sense that we have been able to send our teams on the ground from the north or where the borders are open. But if you're talking about Damascus and in the central part of Syria, which is still controlled by the government, they don't allow us in. And this is the paradox, because what is happening is, if you talk, that the protests started as peaceful protests when they started. Today we are in a situation where both sides are committing human rights violations, unfortunately. In fact, 250,000 people are suffering from siege conditions. So not only are they using human rights violations of the conventional kind, they're also using starvation as a weapon of war, which is a war crime. And our call to the government has been that, because if they're constantly saying that this is not true, that the allegations that we are committing human rights violations are not true, we're saying fair enough. If it's not true, allow independent human rights monitors inside. We have a commission of inquiry from the UN. We have Amnesty International. So if both sides are trading accusations, why don't you allow independent monitors in? And they say, no, 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 we don't want to do that. So it's really a contradiction. You know? So you have peaceful protesters locked up now in large numbers by the government, and you now have civilian hostages being taken by the armed rebel groups. And both of those have to be released to find any political solution, because otherwise it just fuels the situation. And you know, one of the paradoxes of this is that when there was this whole issue about the chemical weapons which came up, you know, as a proportion, very few people have died from chemical weapons in Syria, but conventional weapons nobody seems to bother about. And the West got very bothered about chemical weapons. And overnight, monitors and inspectors were allowed to go and check it. If you have human rights monitors, I can guarantee you that that's a very good way of preventing mass violations as we're seeing today.
The sorting out of the chemical weapons issue, some might argue, is the one reason that certain Western countries didn't have a military intervention in Syria. How does Amnesty feel about military interventions? Do you believe they can be justified if they're going to prevent deaths, mass deaths, or human rights atrocities? Do you believe that it can be justified?
I mean, Amnesty International is not an organization with expertise on military situations. So, for example, you know, in the case of Syria, there was lots of questions being asked to me at different interviews saying, do you think it's right? And our sense was that actually, because of the density of the populations there and the fact that both sides were heavily armed, the chances are that a lot of people are going to die, civilians are going to die. But we are not an expert on military matters, so we don't want to kind of pontificate on issues we don't really understand. Our focus essentially is to say that as we speak now, the core issue is unimpeded, unfettered access to humanitarian aid. Because, you know, you have millions of people, 9 million people have been pushed out of their houses, 2.3 million of them refugees, 6 million internally displaced, and you have to stop killing civilians. That's the core issue, because you could have, an armed intervention or not an armed intervention, but at the end of the day, it's about what's happening to ordinary people. And the refugee issue is very central to us. 97% of the refugees are living just in 5 countries in the neighborhood. And the Europeans, for example, are offering to resettle or to take only 14,000 refugees. It's shameful. You know? Of that, 11,000 only coming from Germany. And these countries are really struggling to cope with the influx. Of course, we always say that please keep your borders open, because the people who are rushing out of Syria are fleeing from persecution. But they're really struggling, and the Western powers are not doing much about it.
Some people have said, though, is it really Amnesty's place to call for European Union countries to basically take in as many Syrian refugees as possible? Is that actually what Amnesty should be doing? Do you have a right to be calling on those European governments to do that?
I mean, every government is accountable. There's an international responsibility. I mean, let's not forget that the Europeans have been very actively involved in the conflict, directly or indirectly. So, and the distance from Nicosia, which is the capital of Cyprus, and Damascus is less than 200 miles. So if Europeans don't help in finding a solution to the refugee problem, Syrians are already coming out through informal means. And what do the Italians and the Greeks and the Europeans do? They push them back into the water. We've seen what happened in Lampedusa. That was from North Africa, but it's not that different with Syrian refugees. So the cost, the human cost of not having a systematic way of bringing in refugees into Europe. The UN Special Rapporteur on this subject said that Europe can accept up to 250,000 refugees a year for the next 5 years without any difficulty. So I think it's a very legitimate point to make when Europe goes and lectures people about human rights. They have a responsibility themselves.
What about Egypt? Again, have you been able to have access to the many thousands of people who are currently in Egyptian jails? Is Amnesty able to talk to these people?
I mean, we have much freer access in Egypt compared to some of the places we talked about, like Syria. But I know Egypt quite well. I've been in and out of the place over the years, and I can't think of a bigger tragedy, really. And we just released, Amnesty International just released a report, the 3rd anniversary after the 25th January revolution. And what we are seeing, the dreams of that whole revolution for dignity, for human rights, I think all those dreams have been dashed. And what we are seeing is an unprecedented scale of human rights violations and state violence. The elected president is in jail, along with thousands of peaceful protesters. And they're introducing anti-protest laws. They're repressing journalists. There's a complete atmosphere of impunity, including 3 Al Jazeera journalists who are locked up as we speak. And we have a situation where, and this is not the attack, of course, when they attack the Muslim Brotherhood, they call them terrorists. But now the attack is not even restricted to the Brotherhood. They're attacking the so-called liberals as well.
When it's such a polarised country, how does Amnesty go about finding its facts in somewhere like Egypt and putting those facts out as being real? How do you know who to believe?
I mean, that is, in a sense, the core of Amnesty's competence and expertise, to make sure that we absolutely have the truth and the evidence. So the process of gathering evidence in an unbiased way, in a triangulated way, in a way that we can absolutely be sure that we are speaking truth to power. That's the central part of our methodology. So we have a dedicated team of researchers. So if you take the case of Egypt, we have people who have deep expertise of the Middle East and Egypt who spend a great deal of time talking to people from all sides. So we don't talk to only one side. We corroborate, we make sure, and so it's very painstaking work, and but it's very systematic, very rigorous. There are several levels of quality checking and cross-checking, independent checking. We also work with a lot of local partners because they are the ones who are facing many of the challenges.
But the local partners, of course, are the ones who are going to have a real opinion about what's happening in the country. They're the ones who are going to be so sensitive to it.
But so as long as what's very important is that you're actually having partners who don't only have one particular view, and for us the ultimate test is international human rights law. So we use that as a kind of touchstone for everything we say.
You've been very vocal on the treatment of migrant workers in Qatar. Lots of reports have been released, particularly to do with the 2022 World Cup situation. How responsive has the Qatari government been to your demands?
I was in Qatar. I met with the Prime Minister. Since then, I met with the Foreign Minister. We met with the Qatar World Cup Committee. And I must say that they've actually, partly to my surprise, that they've been quite open to Amnesty's criticism and recommendations. Our point to them that the World Cup presents a real opportunity for them to address a problem which is a sore, in just not in Qatar, but in all the Gulf countries. And the first report and the first analysis, which has taken us 2 years, because this is a good example. You asked me, how do we do the research? So in this case, we spoke to 25 companies or so. We have had 14 meetings with different government authorities, and we've talked to hundreds of people who are migrant workers themselves. So we would be very careful in putting together our research and analysis. So I think the point there is that, and we've only done the first piece on construction work. We're also going to do the next one on domestic workers. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, many of these countries have the same problem, and it's serious. I mean, I also went to one of the camps there, and I spent a day with the workers themselves, 70 workers, mostly from Nepal. And as soon as they arrive, their passports are taken away. In this case, the Lee Trading, they have not even been paid for 6 or 7 months, so which means they've lost their health cover, they've gone around, borrowed some money, but they can't even go back. They don't even have the money to go back to their country, but they haven't even been paid for a long time, so they need that money to come in. And what the point we're making to the Qatari government is that this is not isolated, this is not an exceptional case. Unfortunately, there are far too many cases like this. And with the World Cup coming up, we have 1 million more workers who are going to come into Qatar. So it's really important, it's urgent that they address this issue.
A report was released recently saying that 185 Nepalese alone died in Qatar last year. And with so much construction work happening at the moment, you've got to fear that those deaths are going to increase unless something is done.
And it can be done. I mean, the important thing is, it is a fact that you've had over 100 Nepalese, many of whom died under what they call cardiac arrest. And it's the saddest part. I come from South Asia myself. The saddest part is, we have to be very grateful in some ways to the Gulf countries that they are providing reasonable employment opportunities for people who are living in abject poverty in Nepal, in India, in Bangladesh. But Qatar is one of the richest countries in the world. They can enforce a system of labor conditions which respect international labor rights. They can and they must do it. And a lot of the companies have the habit of outsourcing and subcontracting, and they feel that if they subcontract, they don't have a responsibility. But that is totally in violation of actually Qatari law and international law. So very simple things can be done, and they can be done today. The practice of exit permits can be ended. No objection certificates, taking the passport away, delayed payments. All of these can be fixed now. And there's a longer term issue about changing the sponsorship or the kafala system. And I think that's a bit more complex. But if the government wants to do it, it is their responsibility to regulate abuses by the employers.
When we're talking about sporting events linked with human rights, is there an argument that huge international sports competitions shouldn't be held in places where human rights have been questioned? I'm moving now, of course, to Sochi, where the Winter Olympics are going to be held. Should Russia have been awarded the Winter Olympics, do you think?
See, Amnesty International's position is one of engagement, not boycott. We believe that actually it's really important to talk to governments and put the facts before them and put pressure on them to do the right thing. And I think that actually having the Sochi Olympics is shining a light, which is what Amnesty is all about. This scandal is about shining a light. So I think the idea that that there's real heat on the Russian government now is important. It's good. Our worry is actually what's going to happen after Sochi, because if you look at what President Putin has done, all these amnesties and pardons and the release of Pussy Riot and Khodorkovsky, the businessman, all of that we know is get the optics right before Sochi. But the underlying issue in Russia is repressive laws which curb a lot of the fundamental freedoms. So if you take the freedom of association, they've brought an NGO law which declares NGOs as foreign agents if they get any foreign funding. They have curbs on freedom of expression, attacks on journalists, criminalizing libel, blasphemy laws, and any peaceful protest, which is the freedom of assembly, is they come down with a very heavy hand. So yes, they've released a few people, but there's so many prisoners of conscience, as we call them, who are people who are peacefully protesting who are locked up.
So you're saying that that Sochi, the Winter Olympics coming to Sochi has prompted changes now, but those changes aren't going to last? In which case, is there a way that sport can actually affect change in places like Russia? Because it doesn't sound like it. I mean, people don't believe it did happen in Beijing, do they?
No, the thing about, and so I just want to say one other point about Sochi itself and Russia, which is, if you look at the way in which they're actively attacking gay people, and the kind of legislation they brought about sexual propaganda, etc. So I think that, this all adds up, and this is what I was going to say about, and the Northern Caucasus. I mean, let's not forget that. Sochi is not far from the place where the gravest human rights abuses happen in Russia. And Amnesty International has documented this for a long period of time. Arbitrary detention, torture, disappearances, extrajudicial executions. So I think that, if you're asking me, will Sochi suddenly change the situation in Russia? Nothing suddenly changes the things, and everything is, it's cumulative, it happens. But it's important, I think, pressure has to be persistent. And that's what Amnesty International does. Our campaigns last for decades sometimes, and change does happen. I believe that these kinds of repressive, unjust laws and behaviors are simply not sustainable.
You took charge of Amnesty International in 2010. Since then, what have you been most proud of? What do you think is the biggest achievement that you have been able to make, or your organisation has been able to make since then?
Well, I wouldn't take any personal credit for it, because as I just mentioned, a lot of Amnesty's campaigns are long-term campaigns. So just to give you one example, a most spectacular and most kind of gratifying example is the passing of the UN Arms Trade Treaty. It's something which Amnesty campaigned for 20 years to regulate the flow of arms between countries and peoples. And we have regulations even for trading bananas, but there was no regulation of how arms move from one place to another. And we've managed to bring a treaty now, which most governments have signed up to, or in the process of signing up to, where if the arms are likely to go to the hands of human rights abusers, that will be blocked. There has to be a due diligence process. So that's one example. We've had the celebrated release of Aung San Suu Kyi, which happened after I joined. Again, a long campaign, and these are celebrated faces and celebrated kind of global issues. But I must say that most of Amnesty's work and successes are about unsung heroes. I've just come from Mali, the people who are struggling there, human rights defenders on the ground, Amnesty working with them to fight for their rights, to release them from prison, to end torture, to end disappearances. It's countless, you can't really list these things, and it makes a real difference. I think Amnesty standing with these people gives them protection, gives them courage, and so I think it's a long list.
Salil Shetty, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera. Thank you very much.